Ladies, gentlemen, and Spiritborn of all ages, the winners keep on winning. Shortly following the release of the 2.0.3 patch yesterday for Diablo 4 and the Vessel of Hated expansion, we had the re-enabling of a number of important items back into the game that we've just been blocked off of having drop from the start. And one of these has a ton of potential, and it is the brand new Shroud of False Death mythic unique added in this season. This has some funky actual unique effect text centered around putting you into stealth, even as a non-stealth based class, but this doesn't really work right now if you're running a mercenary because that disables the effect. And the affixes on it itself are pretty interesting too, including a whack of maximum life, but the main interesting part of it by a landslide is actually the implicit affix, which most people won't even notice at first glance, but it is very plainly and clearly +1 to all passive skills. Literally every passive for your class, 1 bonus rank to all of them. To put it simply, the combined power that this gives, depending on your build of course, for Spiritborn, can be upwards of a 90% damage multiplier, 30% or more damage reduction, and a whole bunch of other utility or harder to quantify bonuses as well. So of course, with this item being brought back into the game properly here, I wanted to try it out and see what its potential was when being fit into Spiritborn builds. Today, we have the result, which is that it's just plain strong as all hell and fits perfectly well into Kepaleke-focused builds, like Quill Folly or today's target, Crushing Hand. The chest piece item slot holds a ton of potential value for these builds though, specifically by using a legendary item and rolling for tempers for either maximum resolve stacks or maximum stacks of the resilience passive for bonus maximum life to funnel through the whole bugged viscous shield Paragon node, even before considering the aspect itself or the other affixes that can roll on this either. But after testing, it does actually come out on top by quite a fair bit, with a few changes based around it as well, of course. So let's talk about the Shroud of False Hands build for Spiritborn, a speedy as hell, Crushing Hands focused build, improved by the addition of this new item, not only just being better overall than it was before really, but also just much easier to achieve the build, both because the majority of the power from this chest piece is from an implicit affix, so Masterworking or specific greater affixes just are not the end of the world at all for this slot anymore, as well as offering resource generation on the chest, which helps ease the need for an absolutely perfect Midnight Sun unique ring for your resource regen. Crushing Hand is a lovely pairing for this too, as it just eases the build requirements of one of the fastest setups that I've seen clear hard content in the game, with my current gear, which is far from being perfect, being able to do a tier 115 Artificer's Pit now in about 4.5 minutes. And on top of being one of the highest damage Spiritborn builds, it's also one of the highest fastest movement ones. So if you are looking to replace your recently nerfed Evade Spiritborn build, this is one of my favorite recommendations to do so, because you won't actually lose too much speed as long as there are enemies to leap to, and you will actually gain a lot of damage overall over the Evade build by quite a fair bit. First things first then, we have our skill tree, and for your basics it doesn't actually matter as we don't actually use them, so you just want to stick 2 points in here wherever you really want to unlock the core skill cluster. Over here we're of course going to be picking up all 5 ranks of Crushing Hand, which is our main damage skill. We also take its enhancement and rampant Crushing Hand for an increase to our damage done per resolve stack that we have. This does scale with your bonus maximum resolve stack stat as well, which is one of our main equipment goals, so this does scale even further with maximum resolve than other builds might. We then take 1 rank of the vigorous passive here for some bonus regeneration for our resource. Only 1 point is actually needed here now with the Shroud of False Death, giving us a bonus rank to this for free, but also having resource generation as an affix on the item itself. Then we take 3 ranks of the balanced exertion passive. This gives us bonus damage with core skills at the cost of higher resource requirement. We then move on to the focus cluster, and here we'll be taking Vortex, as well as enhanced Vortex and also measured Vortex. Altogether, this is a fairly high range pull in effect to group enemies up right on top of you in the perfect Venn diagram of damage that exists between the 2 sides of Crushing Hand. So the enemies will take the full damage of the attack because they're hit by both circles at the same time. It also boosts the damage of your next attack, and also does more damage and knocks enemies down if you have a barrier. We always have a barrier, and we have knockdown enemy bonus damage to synergize with this effect, so this is quite nice. We then also take Ravager as an active skill, as well as this enhancement, and then also measured Ravager. Altogether, this gives us bonus hits to every attack that we do, and these also trigger the bonuses of one of our later passive quite effectively. It extends its own duration as well each time that you get a kill with this active, and then it also grants you bonus resource generation and makes us leap to enemies when we use a core skill. This is why our Crushing Hand just sort of teleport stomps any enemy that you target target with it. We also take some passive ranks here, 1 rank of the Focal Point passive, mostly just as a gateway to let us take 3 ranks of Apex for bonus damage against vulnerable enemies, doubled against elites. Important to note as well that while on the PTR, the Shroud of False Deaths +1 to all passives effect only applied to the passives you have a point in, that is no longer the case. It affects every passive, so we do get the 5% damage reduction from 1 rank of diminishment as well, which is just sort of a neat bonus. We take 1 rank of the Mirage passive, mostly just as a gateway, for 3 ranks of Unrestrained Power for bonus damage while unstoppable or unhindered. We are permanently unstoppable in the setup, so this is permanently active damage multiplier. We then move on to the defensive cluster for the skill tree, and here we'll be taking 3 ranks of the Armored Hide skill. This increases the duration just the right amount for the setup to make it active pretty much permanently. But even this requirement has been eased a little bit by the addition of the new mythic chest, and we'll talk about why in a minute when we reach that passive. We also are going to be taking the enhancement for this skill though, as well as Reinforced Armored Hide, which in total gives us 100% block chance while this effect is active, thorns while active, block damage reduction per close enemies while active, and importantly it also sets us to our max resolve stacks every time that you activate it, and then we pick up counterattack. And I cannot stress enough how much you just do not want to have this on your bar, and even if it is, you should never actually press it and use the active effect. Part of our damage synergy relies on an offensive aspect that doubles its effect whenever you block an enemy. Because of how the game works, the dodge stat takes priority over block, so if you have 100% dodge chance and 100% block chance, you will never actually be able to block because the dodge will happen first. This is a really big damage loss for us, so we put the 1 point in here, we take the enhancement, and then specifically Reinforced Counterattack, which makes it passively increase our crit damage for each close enemy. This means that we get this massive effect that is just a lot of bonus damage without having the negatives of having to have the dodge too. Even without the skill on the bar, this stays active because of our unique ring. We then pick up the Scourge skill over here, as well as its enhancement, which makes us do more crowd control damage per hit than it does to enemies, stacking up to 50% bonus damage at 50 stacks, and then Adaptive Scourge, which gives us a lucky hit chance to lifesteal up to 35% of our max health as damage every time that you deal damage to enemies poisoned by Scourge. So this is just an absolutely ridiculous source of health regen for us. We then take some passives in this cluster too, 1 rank of the Endurance passive, mostly just as a gateway for 3 ranks of Perseverance. This gives us a fair amount of damage reduction per stack of resolve we have. We had a stack a fair bit of bonus maximum resolve. If your gear is absolutely perfect, you would hit 21 maximum resolve stacks with this, so this would end up being 42% damage reduction, which is a pretty large amount from a single passive. It's important to note as well in this cluster, we just sort of by default get a couple of important bonuses here thanks to the Shroud of False Death. 1 point of the Patient Guard passive here gives us 10% block chance. Further ranks into this passive do not change the block chance that it gives us, so the 1 free rank is actually very high value. Same goes for the Nourishment passive as well and the Healing Received bonus that this gives. And given that this build sort of purposely doesn't hit their actual resistance caps because it's just tanky enough that you don't need them, you just sort of take up build space that can be better used, so the free rank of Anti-Venom for poison resistance actually helps offset this a fair bit and is quite useful too. We then have our Potency cluster as well, 3 ranks of the Resilient passive for just a ton of bonus maximum health, and you may notice pretty clearly here that I also have a bunch of bonus ranks because of one of our tempers, and it's a very important one to do that with, which is why we have so many ranks of it. Maximum life just directly scales the bugged effect from the Viscous Shield Paragon board node, which we'll talk about later, so this is a lot of damage as well as survivability. Suffice it to say, for now, maximum life just equals higher damage numbers on Spiritborn for the time being. We also take 3 ranks of the Dominant passive over here for increased damage with Guerrilla skills to knock down enemies, and also a 5% execution chance for non-boss enemies, which is pretty useful too. We then take 3 ranks of the Potent passive skill for a stacking debuff on an enemy anytime that they take damage from one of your Jaguar skills. This counts for every source of damage that we have, as we have Jaguar main Spirit Hull, which applies Jaguar tag to every skill. The result of this is that after 100 hits of any kind from your skills, an enemy will take up to 40% bonus damage with the bonus point from the chest counted in 2. Then we have 3 points that we put into Furnace as a passive as well, and this gives us bonus crit damage with Jaguar skills per ferocity stack that we have, and we both have bonus maximum ferocity stacks due to the duelist aspect, and are also frequently set to overfill our maximum from the Jaguar ultimate too. Speaking of which, we also pick up all 5 ranks of the Hunter ultimate, mostly to reduce its cooldown so that we can have it active more often. We also take its enhancements for damage increases to injured enemies, and the overfill on ferocity when activated, which is very powerful, as well as a chance to reset the ultimate itself if you get kills while the skill is active. The main reason that we wanted to take the extra ranks and reduce the cooldown of this skill is to increase the uptime of a couple of very strong passives that are also in this cluster. The first is 3 ranks of resolution. This increases your damage to elite enemies for a few seconds after you use an ultimate skill. This is doubled if there's only one enemy, which means for bosses, essentially. Then we take the full 3 ranks of spiritual attunement for a bunch of bonus maximum resource, which directly converts to a damage increase for us in this build. We also take 3 ranks of supremacy for a stacking buff whenever you get a kill with an ultimate skill active. You get 5 bonus stacks each time your ultimate skill ends as well, but then it starts to lose 1 stack per second if an ultimate is not active. This is the other main reason that we want low cooldown on the hunter skill, as with this we easily maintain maximum stacks of this in just mob clearing high density content, but it also increases our ability to maintain high stacks in single target situations like boss fights as well, which is very important too. Another important note in this area for the free passives for the mythic chest is the intricacy passive over here. This gives us 1 free cast of a skill after using our ult because of the 1 free rank we get. This essentially is actually 2 free casts because it also resets the cooldown of the skill when this happens. We generally tie this together with either Vortex to group enemies up more frequently, letting you use essentially 3 Vortex charges in a row, 1 before the ult, 1 after the ult, and your cooldown gets reset so you can use it a 3rd time too. This lets you group up enemies nearly as much as the Scorn of the Earth version of this build we did a couple of days ago, but now with way more space for damage increasing because this is just sort of automatic due to the chest piece. The other way that we use this is for Armored Hide and keeping 100% uptime on Armored Hide as much as possible. So if your enemies are already grouped up, you don't need to use it for Vortex, so you can use it for Armored Hide. Otherwise, use it for Vortex to group them to begin with. Then for our final point of the skill tree, we have our key passive, and you might be guessing it is, as usual, the Prodigy's Tempo for this style of build. Our unique weapon makes Crushing Hand count both as a basic and core skill, so every 3rd time we cast it in a row, we get +2 ranks to all skills and reduce all of our active cooldown, so it's pretty irreplaceable in this setup. After that, then we have our Spirit Hull choices. For our primary hull choice, we use Jaguar. It's just way too high damage not to do so. Your biggest damage with this build will always come from this pop of damage whenever it happens. It's partially because it seems to double dip with the Viscous Shield bug, because it bases its damage off of what you've done in the last half second before the proc, which is obviously buffed by Viscous Shield, but then it seems to also have its own damage number when it pops up, boosted by Viscous Shield on top of that too. And these are the numbers that you will see hitting trillions for Spiritborn in some of this footage, and from other people too. Then for secondary Guardian, we go full Gorilla. Maximum Resolve bonus is an important damage and damage reduction increase for us in a few different ways, and the permanent Unstoppable is nice too, though we already have basically achieved that in the build anyways. Following that, we have our uniques for the build. First, the Mythic, which is the Shroud of False Death. This is the new one that was added in with the patch yesterday, and it is just fantastic. I got probably the worst greater affix on mine that I could have for this build at least, as we never really use the stealth part at all, but the implicit affix of the bonus passive ranks is just insane. As for the priorities of greater affix and masterworking procs, it's pretty much just fully into the maximum life proc to scale damage for Viscous Shield, though bonus all stats is not bad either, though you should be reaching all Paragon's board stat breakpoints just by having this equipped to begin with, honestly, even at the regular roll. After that, we have our regular uniques, with the main one being the Rod of Kepeleke. This also had a change in the patch yesterday that increased its output for this build specifically, where previously the chance to hit twice affix on this was only partially affecting Crushing Hand as a skill, where when it triggered that, it would just do 1 extra smash instead of the 2 that the skill does. This is essentially half the damage that it should do on the proc, but now it does the full 2 bonus hits, so that is actually a doubling to the potency of this affix, essentially. This does also change the ideal masterworking and greater affix rolls for this, now as the effectiveness is up of this one specifically. So ideally you would have the greater affix on both this and maximum resource, but if you can only get one, you basically want to put one masterworking proc on whichever of the 2 you get a greater affix for, and the other 2 on the one that isn't a greater affix. If you have both of these affixes as a greater, then 2 masterworking procs on max resource, the other one on chance to hit twice. Aside from this, you absolutely need a high roll on the unique effect too. There's a lot of words to the effect here, but the roll itself boils down to being up to a 3% increased crit damage multiplier for each resource that you spend when this procs. It will proc on every hit, so this matters a lot. A low roll of the effect is 1% per resource spent, a maximum roll is 3%, so it is basically 3 times as much damage to have a high roll when this procs. And while the affixes are very useful on the weapon, the unique effect is also incredibly incredibly important to focus here too, possibly the most important part of it all. After that we have our ring, which solves the resource generation hole that Kepeleke's effect puts you in otherwise, which will be the Ring of Midnight Sun. This restores up to 50% of the resource that you've spent in the last 2 seconds whenever you get a critical hit, and this loop just lets us dump full resource through Kepeleke, then with a high enough resource generation stat, we then get a crit and restore the full amount we spent through this unique. In the past, I've recommended a 50% roll above all else on this item, and while a high roll is still very important, with our mythic chest having resource generation and the extra passive point that we get too, it's actually far less dire if you have a 40 to 45% roll on your ring now with a greater affix maybe, rather than 50% and a non-ancestral. The masterworking procs for this one should just be dexterity really, though cooldown reduction does have its uses too, mostly more for pit pushing than for just generally playing the build in most content. The final unique then is the Banished Lord's Talisman. This makes it so when you spend 275 resource, your next crushing hand is guaranteed to overpower. We take advantage of this by making sure we spend 275 resource with every single hit, thus triggering this for every single attack. And that's why every hit is just absolutely full of orange numbers popping up all over your screen. As for how to achieve this, we do it through a combination of gear, skill points, and Paragon. You get 100 maximum resource by default, of course. We have 4 ranks of the Spiritual Attunement passive for 40 bonus maximum resource. We get maximum resource affix on our helmet with a greater affix, or even just no greater affix but masterworking the rest of the item around it without even proccing max resource even once would still be around 30 bonus maximum resource, so we're now at 170. You also get a ton from your weapon itself. A base Kepeleke is 24 maximum resource, which even without masterworking puts us at 194, but you can get greater affix or masterworking procs as well and double this up to like 48 easily, if not get full luck and have it hit even higher. So let's say 218 total maximum resource for now. Then we have 69 bonus max resource from our Paragon board with full glyph upgrade, but you can hit half of that super easily without too much upgrading required, so let's lowball that down at 34. Added on to reach 242 maximum resource, and it's important to stop here and note that the Banished Lord's Talisman actually adds on the based costs of Crushing Hand to the calculation here, which is 34. So whenever you spend your full max resource, it also adds 34 onto the number that you would spend naturally, so actually at 242 max resource, this is already enough to permanently overpower as a result, regardless of the fact that I purposefully didn't count a ton of masterworking potential or the existence of the resourcefulness elixir for a bonus 25 maximum resource as well, just to prove the point that you can hit way above the maximum resource that you need to trigger this effect actively. Though all of these sources are important to know about because of these actual maximum resource above this breakpoint as well, still increases your damage pretty dramatically for every single point. As for the stats on the Banished Lord's Talisman, then maximum life, attack speed, and core skills are of relatively similar importance for this setup. Maximum life is the highest priority, followed by attack speed, then core skill ranks. But the unique effect is also very important. Even a double greater affix isn't really worth using unless it's at least over 50% on the effect roll, but ideally it hits 60% with some good affixes on it too. After that we have our Legendaries and how we have those actually set up in our remaining slots. Starting with our remaining ring then, we have the Moonrise aspect for both attack speed bonus and bonus damage with our Crushing Hand too. Then on the ring itself we look for Lucky Hit to make enemies vulnerable. This is our main source of applying vulnerable. It's pretty much the only one we have. You do not need this as a greater affix, you do not need any masterworking procs on the effect, but the base roll being on your ring to begin with is extremely important. Your other rolls then should be maximum life and attack speed, with both of these having similar priority for greater affix and masterworking procs. For tempers you want resource generation to help us enable full resource resetting, and then overpower damage is the highest additive damage that we can put on that affects our consistent damage because we're overpowering all the time. Then for our gloves we have the redirected force aspect, and this increases your critical strike damage for a portion of your block chance, but it's pretty buggy right now. The intention of this aspect is to cap out at 100% block chance with what it converts, so a maximum bonus of 70% for a perfect roll on the aspect. But for whatever reason, it counts block chance from additional sources as separately reaching over 100%. So we get 100% bonus block chance from activating Armored Hide, but that actually stacks on top of the 45% base block chance from an Ancestral Quarterstaff, the 10% block chance from our skill tree, the 16% block chance from our Paragon board, for a total of 171% block chance, which all counts for this aspect, which means with a maximum roll, you'd get 119.7% increased critical damage from this one effect. Not to mention it gets doubled anytime that you successfully block, so it's more like 240%. Yeah, Spiritborn is a little bit busted. This is one of the big reasons for that. On this piece, your highest priority is Crushing Hand skill ranks, which is also where you would want your greater affix and all Masterworking procs if you had to choose. The other two natural affixes that you want are maximum life, and then either dexterity if you care about completing higher tier bits, or armor otherwise just to bring us closer to the cap without using elixirs or incenses. Again, you do not need to hit the armor or resistance cap to survive in this build, even on Torment 4, even in high-ass pit tiers, but it is an option if you just want to be comfortable and not have to rely on hitting enemies to actually be tanky. Then for your tempers, here we take overpowered damage gain, and then Vortex size increase. This lets us make our Vortex larger than the Crushing Hand itself, which helps us group things up again to that Venn diagram of damage right between the two circles of Crushing Hand. Then we have our pants, which have the interdiction aspect on it, which is also extremely important to our combos. This increases our block chance by up to 15% per resolve stack, and you remember how I said redirected force was a 240% crit damage increase when it was perfectly done? Well, we did that before counting this in just for a bit of extra fun here. If you hit the full procs on the helmet, you would have plus 11 maximum resolve stacks, plus 2 from our Spirit Hall choice, that would be 13, on top of the base number of 8 maximum resolve. So 21 maximum resolve stacks, which will be sitting at massively and frequently, is up to 315% block chance from this aspect alone. 315% block chance added onto the redirected force aspect brings it up to a maximum potential of 680% bonus crit damage with maximum rolls on the aspect and perfect masterworking, and to get the successful block as well. On the pants, we take bonus ranks to basic skills, which affects Crushing Hand because of Kepaleke. We take maximum life, and we also take armor. Maximum life and basic skill ranks are pretty equal greater affix priority to begin with, but it's much easier to find greater affix maximum life. For the tempering on this, you want ranks of resilient passive for bonus maximum health to scale your viscous shield, as well as barrier generation to help our earthen bulwark and Crushing Hand combo to continually refill our maximum life amount in barrier pretty much just every couple of hits. For masterworking, your priority is resilient ranks entirely. You want every proc on this if you can. Then for your helmet, we have the duelist aspect, which gives bonus maximum stacks of ferocity. This pairs incredibly well with a number of the other sort of moving parts in this build, the passives and such. For the affixes, you want maximum resource, maximum life, and armor gain, with maximum resource being the ideal singular greater affix. For tempering, you want barrier generation once again, and then specifically bonus maximum resolve in this slot. You ideally want all 3 masterworking procs for this armor piece to also be on maximum resolve for this to reach your ideal sort of balance. Then finally on your boots, we take the aspect of apprehension for bonus damage to feared enemies, and fear applied to enemies that are slowed by 80% or more. We mostly just use this to combo with Scourge, constantly fearing enemies, and for bosses where it applies while they are staggered and gives us a bunch of extra damage too. Then for the actual affixes on boots, we grab dexterity, maximum life, and movement speed, with the ideal greater affixes being dexterity over maximum life. And then for tempers, we take barrier generation and movement speed, with the ideal masterworking procs being a mix of dexterity and maximum life, basically balancing it out for 2 on the affix if you don't get a GA in it, 1 on the affix that you do get a GA in. If you do happen to get both as greater affixes, then put 2 on dexterity and 1 on maximum life. Then finally for gear, we have our gems and our runewords as well. In your jewelry, we have 1 diamond for all resistance increase. Then we have an amethyst for shadow resistance increase, and a sapphire for cold resistance increase. The main reason for this split is that we get fire and lightning resistance pretty heavily from our ring specifically, and our Paragon board. We get some poison resistance from the ring and from our skill tree too, so cold and shadow are the elements that need a little bit of love to keep up with the others. Then in our armor slots, you want 1 amethyst for barrier generation to hit our requirements, and then 3 emeralds for bonus dexterity. After that is the rune words that we use too. We use the ritual rune that gives offering for spending a percentage of maximum resource, combined with the invocation for earthen bulwark. This creates a large barrier on ourself every time that we spend 300% of our maximum resource, which is every 3 Crushing Hand casts thanks to Kepaleke. Then in our other slot, we have the ritual rune, which actually activates offering every time that you use a skill from another class, combined with the invocation rune to give us 20% maximum life when triggered. In our setup, this is every 6 Crushing Hand casts, because every 2 earthen bulwark activates this effect. We do this frequently enough to keep the bonus maximum life active permanently, both increasing our tankiness and our damage due to viscous shield. Next up, we have your Mercenaries and the choices that you make for these. You want Rahir as your primary generally, with the right side path taken for the setup for both the all element resistances, which you can follow down to also give him a couple of damage multipliers too. But these do require enemies to stand still a little bit, so if you want to go more pure damage, you would actually go the left side instead through the bonus armor on the left side here to help you reach the cap, all the way down to the bonus damage multipliers from Mocking Lure whenever an enemy is taunted by Rahir. Then for our reinforcement choice, we go for Variana with the Bloodthirst attack, giving us some bonus attack speed on a timer, which is nice to have. Then also worth mentioning before we move on, while we don't reach armor and resistance caps naturally because we don't really need to, as long as we are attacking, nothing can actually kill us really, because we're regaining so much barrier with such a high health pool that nothing can break through. But we do reach specific stats that we do to enter that point, especially as we count in the addition of elixirs and incenses for pushing into harder content like higher tier pit runs. Through incense, you can actually quite easily gain an extra 350 armor, 150 from Soothing Spices, 200 from Song of the Mountain, and that would put us above the armor cap, which is pretty good to see. But this also gives you an extra 10% resistance to all elements and a little bit of extra maximum resistance too, which brings us a lot closer to the resistance caps that I mentioned before we have uncapped on purpose. Then you can also use the Chorus of War, which just gives you a bunch of extra all stats and some increase to crit and overpower damage, which is nice to have in general. As well, worth mentioning, the Elixir of Resourcefulness, such a big deal for this build, so much power is gained from this elixir, it's very good, and all of these things are actually relatively cheap to craft this season, relative to, of course, how easy it is to farm the materials to make them. Following that, then, we have our Paragon board set up for the build, of course, and this season especially, the amount of Paragon points that every individual player has will not be identical. So I'll show you my board, where it's at currently with my current amount of points, with the note that if you have less points than I do, your main goal is to hit all of the legendary nodes and the Paragon glyphs for the most part, outside of anything that I specifically outline as being important. If you have more points than I do, I will talk about what I would ideally do with those at the end. For your starting board, then, you want to go up and right directly to the glyph socket itself and put in the Colossal glyph. This increases the damage you do with Guerrilla skills and gives you 2% bonus multiplicative damage per resolve stack that you have. With our maximum resolve bonus being perfectly masterworked to 21 resolve stacks, that would be a 42% damage increase, so it's pretty meaty for sure. We grab just enough strength in the radius to activate this glyph, then we grab the rare and magic nodes as well of relevance and exit out of the top side of the board where we attach on Viscous Shield, like so. We head up and left to the very important damage reduction while barriered rare and magic nodes over on the left side, then we go to the legendary node itself, and this is just one of the most singular bugged parts of Spiritborn. This is intended to give you damage increase per percentage of maximum life that you have as a barrier. If it did that, it would cap out at a 33.3% damage increase when you have full life as barrier, but this instead seems to scale off of the base life number. When you are level 60 with no max life increases, which is what it considers your base life, you have around 400. I'm currently sitting at 12,000 life, so because it gives you essentially 33.3% damage increase for every 400 life you have as a barrier, this means with 12,000 max life and 100% life as barrier, this is just barely under a 1000% damage increase for me at this point, and that's not even with the extra 20% life from the Runeword counted in as well. So yeah, this is pretty bugged. It's silly, but it's a thing that's currently powering all of the strongest Spiritborn builds, so of course we're going to use it. We then also grab the armor and maximum life rare magic nodes up here, then wrap around for the glyph socket itself, inside of which we put in the outmatch glyph. This increases the rare node potency of rare nodes in the radius, which is pretty good in this slot specifically, so we take those as well, of course, and the secondary effect of the glyph 2 is an increased damage bonus to non-elite enemies and bosses, which is quite strong as well. We take the magic nodes of relevance in the radius 2, the strength to actually activate the effect, then we head out of the right side of the board and attach on the sapping board. We go up through the maximum life and all resistance increasing rare and magic nodes, we go up and over to the maximum resource increase and resource generation nodes too, which are quite good for us, then we go to the legendary node of the board itself, which makes it so when we cast 3 crushing hands in a row, we restore 15% of our vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. To put this simply, we will be absolutely spamming crushing hands. You will cast it 3 times in a row very frequently, much more often than 5 seconds, so this is a permanently active damage increase. We then also go through the actual resistance and armor increasing rare magic nodes, as well as the attack speed increasing rare magic nodes to get to the glyph socket of the board, in which we're going to put the Menagerist glyph. This increases the effect of all magic nodes within the radius, and this is actually very, very important in this slot. Over here we have magic nodes for increased maximum resource. By default, these are +4 maximum resource each, with a fully upgraded Druid Menagerist Glyph, these goes up to plus 15 for each of these. So it's an extra 11 maximum resource for each of these nodes, so an extra 33 maximum resource as a result of putting this glyph in this slot and upgrading it. This also has the secondary bonus effect of making it so anytime you use a skill with the base guardian of any of the 4, you get a 4% damage increase for 10 seconds, stacking once per each spirit. Meaning, if you use one skill from each spirit over the course of 10 seconds, you will get a consistent 16% damage increase. We do this quite actively, so this is again a very consistent damage increase. We take the nodes that we need to get the actual secondary bonus active. We take the actual magic nodes of relevance too, just because these ones also give us a very nice increase from the glyph, and then we're going to head out of the actual top of the Viscous Shield board first here. Here we're going to be attaching on the Revealing board, and your first goal will be going left over to the Legendary node through the maximum life and armor increase rare and magic nodes here. The Legendary effect itself then is a lucky hit chance to knock down enemies that are vulnerable, and also a 30% increased damage multiplier to crowd controlled enemies just in general, which is pretty nice for stacking with our other crowd control damage increases too. Then after that, you actually want to head back over to the Sapping board, and this time we'll be just heading out the top side and attaching on the Infighter board. Here you want to go up and around through the rare and magic maximum life and all resistance increasing nodes over to the legendary slot itself. Here this actually gives you an extra 2% increased attack speed and 1% increased damage every time that you either dodge or block an attack, up to 9 stacks. We keep this at full stacks very regularly because we have incredibly just ridiculously high block chance, so we'll always have this full, with the full effect being 18% bonus attack speed and 9% increased damage, which is pretty nice. Then we wrap up and around through the block chance and all resist increasing rare and magic nodes over to the glyph socket for the board. Inside of this one we put the Spirit glyph, and this increases your critical strike damage for every bit of dexterity purchased in the radius. The secondary effect of this also puts a debuff on enemies, where every time you get a crit against them, they will take increased damage from you, stacking up to a 15% increase multiplier at a maximum. We then take the rare and magic nodes of relevance in the radius, as well as the required dexterity to actually activate the glyph, before exiting out the left side of the board to reattach onto the Revealing board in a way to skip a few nodes and go over to the glyph socket through the rare magic nodes as quickly as we can. The actual glyph that we put in this socket then is Revenge. This gives you a bonus to all the rare nodes in the radius, which in here is just pure crowd control damage, which is great, as well as vulnerable damage, which is really good because we don't have a whole lot of additive vulnerable damage from other sources, so this is actually quite good to have in a high quantity from this singular place. Then the secondary effect of the Revenge glyph 2 makes it so when an enemy takes Thorns damage from you, they get a stacking debuff, increasing your damage to them, up to being another 15% damage multiplier. We have Thorns a lot of the time due to the active effect of Armored Hide, but also thanks to one of the passives activated by just using the Shroud of False Death, we will always have a minimum of 40 Thorns just as a basis to activate this effect no matter what. This one doesn't really take too much effect outside of pushing higher tier pits, because you won't really stack up the 15 Thorns hits on enemies unless they are alive for a long time, and absolutely nothing outside of higher tier pits is alive for longer than 1 or 2 hits at most with this build, even on Torment 4, no problem. At this point, for your remaining points, you want to then head up through this middle tree here on the Revealing board, with your aim being to get this attack speed, rare and magic nodes over here, as well as the armor increase, rare and magic nodes right here, just for a little bit more armor. After that, you want to take these few points into the bottom right corner of the Infighter board to get you some maximum fire resistance, as well as just some general fire resistance increase too, to help bring us a little bit closer to that cap, not because we need to again, but because it just makes it a little bit more comfortable. Once you've done that, that's all of my points. So what I would do from here is increase things like the magic nodes that are very, very close to being taken off of our other increases, things like the critical strike damage increases down here, or the just general damage increases that are just off of the boards that we've taken, just off of the points that are right nearby. Then past that, you want to increase the amount of stats taken within the radius of the glyphs that can be increased like this. The main one that you want to do is the Colossal glyph. For every 5 strength that you add to this, you add a bunch of damage with Guerrilla skills. We don't have too much of that additive bracket, so adding more of this just adds a lot. Then secondarily, you want to put in more dexterity within the radius of the Spirit glyph. This increases your critical strike damage, which is quite important. We already have a fair amount of additive critical strike damage, but every bit does help because all of our damage is going to be crits, and a lot of our damage is multipliers to our crits as well. And that pretty much does it for our actual Paragon board and how to actually put the build together in pretty much every way. So let's now talk about playing the build. For the most part, this is pretty simple. Vortex to group things up, Armored Hide to gain tons of survival and damage, Ravager you want active 100% of the time, and Scourge you want to spam for crowd control and damage buff stacking. Aside from those concepts, you basically want to keep all of these skills on cooldown constantly because of the effects like Menagerist that they activate, but also because Prodigy's Tempo as our key passive reduces all of our active cooldowns. So if you have something unused, it's basically just a waste of those cooldown resets. Then there is our ultimate skill, the Hunter. You also want to use this basically on cooldown to keep the Resolution and Supremacy passive skill buffs rotating and active at high buffs, but then there is a slight consideration of the order that you press these buttons due to the Intricacy passive that we get 1 rank of as well. In most situations, Armored Hide is the best option to get bonus free casts for and the cooldown reset too. This makes it very easy to keep 100% uptime on Armored Hide, but there are situations where Vortex makes more sense to group things up a bit more proactively, like moving 2 groups of enemies together in the middle into one, and especially on boss fights, I will occasionally choose to use Scourge for this for the free cast to just reach a stagger bar filling sooner on a boss and change the timings up a bit on when your damage windows are. Outside of all that, just spam the absolute hell out of Crushing Hand and try to make sure at least your main target in any group of enemies is directly between the 2 damage circles so they take your full blast. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A full detailed guide to the Crushing Hand build for Spiritborn, upgraded and updated massively for the release of the Shroud of False Death mythic unique chess piece. This thing absolutely slaps in a quite literal way where you slap the ground, and it slaps so much harder than it did just a couple of days ago without this because of a few relatively simple changes, mostly allowed just by the existence of this new mythic unique. I hope you've all enjoyed this video then, and I hope you enjoy using this build too if you try it out for yourself. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.